Welcome to our YouTube channel, Mystery Insights. Today, we delve into the bone-chilling saga of one of America's most notorious serial killers, Gary Ridgway, infamously known as the Green River Killer. It's the case that once terrorized not just Western Washington, but an entire nation for decades. His horrifying reign of terror spanned over 2 decades, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history.
The Pacific Northwest for decades, but tonight there's a sense of closure for some. In the 80s and 90s, dozens of women and girls were found murdered in our area by serial killer Gary Ridgway, better known as the Green River Killer. Tonight, after nearly 40 years, the remains of his last unidentified victim finally has a name.
Before we dive in, if you find this video informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon for more true crime stories. Join us today as we uncover the unsettling events that unfolded. Gary Ridgway's story begins in the early 1980s in Washington state. Gary Leon Ridgway was active during the 1980s and 1990s. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah, he grew up in a seemingly ordinary family. But behind the facade, a monster was lurking. His father was a bus driver and his mother a sales clerk. The younger Ridgway later claimed that his mother engaged in inappropriate behavior. Notably, he alleged that after wetting the bed, a habit that persisted into his early teens, she would wash his genitals. At some point, he began fantasizing about killing her. Gary Ridgway's journey to becoming a killer would begin early, when he was still a teenager. Ridgway liked hurting things from an early day, starting with shooting birds with a BB gun. But he had a taste for bigger prey, and one day when he was still in high school, he approached a random 6-year-old boy with a knife and stabbed him, deep enough to injure the boy's liver. What made Ridgway so dangerous?
I always want to know what it felt like to kill somebody.
He knew how to bide his time. After his first foray into attempted murder, Ridgway seemed to be slipping back into normal life. He graduated high school, married his high school girlfriend, Claudia Craig. He was married 3 times. According to women in his life, Ridgway had an insatiable sexual appetite. His 3 ex-wives and several ex-girlfriends reported that he demanded sex from them several times a day. Often, he would want to have sex in a public area or in the woods.
He had a very insatiable appetite for sex. His wives said that he would sometimes demand sex 2 and 3 times a day. That wasn't enough. He had some kinky ideas about being outside. He liked to have sex outside.
Ridgway himself admitted to having a fixation with sex workers, with whom he had a love-hate relationship. He frequently complained about their presence in his neighborhood, but he also took advantage of their services regularly. In a statement read at his plea hearing, Gary Ridgway said he hated prostitutes and didn't want to pay them for sex. Some have speculated that Ridgway was torn between his lusts and his staunch religious beliefs. With his second wife, Marcia, Ridgway had a son. After graduating from high school in 1969, Ridgway served in the U.S. Navy for 2 years before settling in the Seattle area. It was 1969, and he was soon sent to Vietnam. But while wartime was a formative experience for many young men, for Ridgway, it would lead him further down the path to becoming a serial killer. Beginning in 1982, dozens of young women in King County simply disappeared. Some were murdered and unceremoniously discarded, often in groups around King County. The fate of others remained unknown. Many of these young women were teenagers. Almost all were involved in street prostitution, and they met their fates while working the street. These disappearances and deaths remained unsolved. They terrified and intimidated the community. For 20 years, these deaths and disappearances were attributed to the so-called Green River Killer, an unidentified serial murderer or murderers. Despite the efforts of scores of detectives and forensic scientists who reviewed hundreds of items of physical evidence and interviewed thousands of witnesses, the cases remained unsolved. The Green River Task Force was formed in response to the alarming number of unsolved murders, particularly those involving young women engaged in sex work. The Green River Task Force was a multi-agency initiative. It brought together investigators from various local law enforcement agencies, including the King County Sheriff's Office and the Seattle Police Department. The task force aimed to centralize information, share intelligence, and coordinate investigative efforts to solve the growing number of murders. that they now believed were connected to one person. To get some insight into the mind of the serial killer, the Green River Task Force interviewed Ted Bundy, who was sitting on death row for his own murder spree. Bundy helped the task force understand the mind of a serial killer. He told them that Ridgway was using the women for sex because it was easy, and he probably returned to their bodies to have sex with them. Despite the tireless efforts of the Green River Task Force and various law enforcement agencies to apprehend the elusive killer, Ridgway managed to evade authorities for nearly 2 decades. After some investigations and a lot of chaos going on in the county, it was believed that Gary Ridgway was behind all of these cases. In 2001, Ridgway was arrested. His DNA matched evidence from several victims. He confessed to at least 49 murders, but the actual toll may be higher. His first victim was thought to have been a 16-year-old girl who went missing after leaving her foster home in July 1982. Her body was found a week later in the Green River. Over the next 2 years, Ridgway raped and killed more than 40 women, many of whom were prostitutes or runaways. A number of Ridgway's early victims were later found in or near the river, giving rise to the nickname Green River Killer. Other bodies were discovered in remote wooded areas. After 1984, he committed several more murders, the last occurring in 1998. His victims were often vulnerable young women, many of whom were runaways or sex workers. Ridgway's method was particularly cruel, often luring these women with the promise of money or a ride, only to strangle them. After killing them, he would dump their bodies in forested and overgrown areas in King County along the Green River. Because of the remote locations, the bodies were usually skeletonized by the time authorities found them. Ridgway also contaminated the scenes with other people's cigarette butts, used gum, and other garbage in an attempt to confuse police. As one of America's most prolific serial killers, Gary Ridgway earned his moniker from the area where he chose to dispose of his victims along the banks of the Green River in Washington state. Ridgway was convicted of killing 49 women between 1982 and 2001, though he confessed to 71 murders, and it is believed he committed more than 90. To his friends and neighbors, Ridgway came across as a stand-up guy and loving father and husband, a characteristic he often exploited in order to give his victims a false sense of security.
How do I know you're gonna treat me good? You could be the maniac killing all these girls for all I know.
I look like the Green River Killer. He's a big guy, something like 6'3".
This delves into every facet of Ridgway's complicated psyche, exposing how he eventually transformed into a prolific serial killer. In the following year, additional forensic evidence led to 3 more murder charges. These 7 charges implicated Ridgway in only a fraction of the Green River homicides. He was linked to only one of 8 major areas where the victims' remains were discovered. Even after Ridgway was charged with these 7 murders, it was speculated that another killer remained at large. Little evidence connected Ridgway to any of the other 42 homicides. Now, after months of interviews with detectives and experts, Ridgway has confessed to most of the original Green River homicides and to a number of other murders in King County. He admitted to killing 6 women whose deaths were unsolved and had never been attributed to the Green River Killer, and he led the police to the bodies of 4 of his victims, remains that would otherwise never have been recovered. Ridgway's confirmed 48 killings puts him at the top tier, and he's confessed to killing 71 women in total, although many of the others are unconfirmed. He continues to cooperate with investigators as they look into missing person cases from the time period he may be linked to. But he's not the only serial killer who claims to have a horrifyingly high death toll. On December 18, 2003, King County Superior Court Judge Richard A. Jones sentenced Ridgway to 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole to be served consecutively.
Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 1 for the death of Wendy Lee Caulfield?
Guilty.
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 2?
Guilty. Guilty.
He was also sentenced to an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of the 48 victims, adding 480 years to his 48 life sentences. He tearfully apologized for killing all those young ladies, as a judge sentenced him Thursday to life in prison without the chance of release. Most of the relatives sobbed and some shook with anger as they tried to describe the inexpressible grief of having a mother, daughter, or sister disappear at his hands.
Our memory, when it comes to all of the women you took, was gone. Our memory is not. In your words, you said that they didn't mean anything to you, but she meant everything to us.
She was a mother, she was a wife, she was a sister, and we miss her.
As each family member spoke of their sadness and rage, Ridgway maintained a blank stare, though he sometimes nodded at their comments and a few times dabbed away a tear that slipped out beneath his dark-rimmed glasses. Gary Ridgway's legacy is one of horror and tragedy. His crimes remind us of the importance of forensic science, thorough investigations, and collaboration. As we remember the victims, let's hope that their stories serve as a beacon for justice and a reminder to protect the vulnerable. The Green River Killer is conceivably one of the clearest examples that evil exists in our world. Gary Ridgway's case remains a haunting chapter in criminal history. The murders have inspired numerous Hollywood films, including 2005's Green River Killer, which explores the investigation into the Green River Killer case. Several documentaries have covered the Green River Killer case, providing insights into the investigation, the victims, and the impact of Ridgway's crimes. One notable documentary is The Green River Killer, Mind of a Monster. Even though he was charged with 49 counts of murder, it is widely believed that Ridgway murdered at least 71 girls and women near Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. In court statements, Ridgway stated that he had killed so many that he lost count. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the wilderness. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. And if you or someone you know is struggling, please don't hesitate to reach out for help. You are not alone. And if you want to know how a father killed his own wife and daughter while secretly living in a bunker with all of the mysteries, check out this video.